All right. By our watch, it is now 10 a.m., so we're going to get started. Greetings, and thank you for tuning in to the Active Transportation Resource Center's latest webinar. Today, our focus is First Last Mile Active Transportation Connections to Transit. My name is Victoria Custodio, and I'll be the facilitator for today's webinar. Next slide. Okay. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Active Transportation Resource Center's webinar series, we always do some framing so we identify what are the learning objectives for those who are participating on the call. So for today, our objectives are as followed. We hope that you will understand how to encourage increased walking and bicycling in connection with public transit use. Also, that you will understand how first and last mile projects are environmental and health benefit multipliers. We will ask you to you should be able to identify sources of funding for first last mile projects. And then lastly, we hope that this webinar will inspire you to apply for funds for these types of projects in your region. We are very pleased to have two wonderful presenters today. First, we'll hear from Jacob Lieb, the Senior Director for First Last Mile Planning for LA Metro. Jacob leads the agency's efforts to plan and deliver station access and safety improvements for LA's growing transit network. Mr. Lieb's prior work at Metro and also at the Southern California Association of Governments focused on a variety of planning and policy issues, including sustainability, equity, and affordable housing. After Jacob, we'll hear from Shannon Simmons, who is the Senior Rail and Transit Coordinator in Caltrans Division of Rail and Mass Transportation. Shannon coordinates transit integration with a specific focus on first and last mile connectivity. Prior to this role, Shannon researched ridership trends, station area design, and equitable access to transit as contributions to the 2018 State Rail Plan. Before we launch into the presentations, I have two items that I need to cover, the first of which is brief housekeeping and webinar logistics. Please know that this webinar will be recorded and posted to the Active Transportation Resource Center website. We always follow up our webinars by sending you a link to the recording once it's been posted. Next, questions and comments are encouraged. You may enter questions into the WebEx chat feature at any time. After Jacob's presentation, we will take one or two questions, but we'll plan on having the longer question and answer session after Shannon's presentation is complete. I'll also mention that in the room we are joined today by Emily Abrahams, who many of you are already aware of. Emily is the Active Transportation Resource Center Program Manager in Caltrans Division of Local Assistance, and she will be helping to answer questions during our question and answer period. All right. So before we begin, we had some poll questions, but I think we're actually going to need to skip them, and so I apologize. We forgot to load the questions, so they're not going to be we're not going to have them for us, which is unfortunate. But we are curious about who you are and how you characterize your own understanding of first last mile transit projects, and then how often you address transit in your work. So I'm wondering if there's a way that maybe we can load the questions before the question and answer session and just re-ask them at that point in time. So I apologize to our speakers for not having this available, but we will get that for the question and answer session later, and that'll help inform who's on the call. And we also see that there are attendees still rolling on into the call. So, all right. On that note, I think we are going to have our first presenter, Jacob. Can we unmute Jacob? All right, Jacob, are you there?
I am there. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. All right, take it away.
Okay, thanks so much. It's always great to have the opportunity to talk to a statewide audience about what we're up to here at LA Metro. I had shared with the Active Transportation Resource Center staff that I had some ambivalence about inspiring the competition for statewide ATP funding, but if you'll all agree to give us a little bit of a head start, we're really proud about the work that we do and happy to have the opportunity to share it with you. So I'm going to talk with you through the work that we do in our First Last Mile program here at Metro. We think it's unique both in its the comprehensive approach that we have to addressing our transit system, as well as some of the planning methodology and engagement approaches that we employ to work with communities around LA County. So without further ado, I'll get started. So just by way of introduction, what you see on the slide is sort of our working definition of first last mile. The key thing to pay attention to here is that by far the majority of people accessing the transit system around LA County are walking, biking, or rolling to transit stations. So for us, thinking about a first last mile strategy, we think about all sorts of access solutions and approaches to stations, but by and large, our focus is on making the walking, biking, and rolling environment around stations better. That's how we're going to be able to serve most of our transit riders. So for all intents and purposes, what we do with First Last Mile is an active transportation program. And sometimes that can be a little bit out of balance in terms of the amount of attention that the different types of access strategies get. I mean, we hear a lot of conversation and a lot of interest around things like pickup, drop-off, parking, shuttling, and so forth. But we think the common denominator across all stations and across the system is walkability, bikeability, ability to ride a skateboard. That's going to be the access solution that works for most people around LA County using the transit system. So in terms of how we think about First Last Mile specifically in Los Angeles County, it really relates to some of the conditions where our transit stations are located and the history of the system, particularly as we've been building rail transit at Metro since 1990. So in a lot of cases, and not in all cases, we have transit stations, both rail and bus, where we put in a station, put in a line, and sort of thought or hoped that nothing else would change. And so what that means is that we have a transit network that in a lot of locations is fitted to an auto-oriented landscape and provides for conditions that are not, in a lot of cases, hospitable or safe for those 85% of transit riders that are walking, biking, and rolling to stations. So the larger vision of our First Last Mile program is that we have a transit network that facilitates travel across the city and around the region, but that each transit station serves as a node for a localized network that facilitates travel by active transportation so that you can make that connection either from your home to the station and then from the station to your school, work, or wherever you're going. So just a little bit different take on sort of the backstory and how we got to the point of having the program that we do, and more at a policy level. The story really starts in earnest with the development of a First Last Mile strategic plan that was adopted by the Metro Board of Directors in 2014. We really think about the strategic plan at sort of two levels. First has to do with making the case for First Last Mile as part of the set of strategies or objectives for Metro as a transit agency. So it's really two sides of the same coin in that regard. First of all, we think of First Last Mile as being a critical piece of our overall transit ridership strategy by really enabling more Angelenos to be able to access transit stations, but it's also, as we think about ourselves as an agency that's increasingly involved in active transportation as a funder, planner, and otherwise, it's an organizing framework for those activities. We think of the best sort of multiplier effect and framework for us to do active transportation activity is to focus a lot of what we do in active transportation around transit stations and transit access. And so if you take a step back and think about that maybe more at a personal level, we like to think about first last mile as the active transportation investment for people that unlocks the potential of the city and of the large region. So you think about if you can make a bicycle trip to a transit station, and that transit station, think about all of the jobs, educational opportunities that are now available to a person that might not have been otherwise. The second thing that the first last mile strategic plan does is establish our planning methodology. So it allows us to look at what's going on around any transit station and to have a process that arrives at a plan, which is a set of improvements or investments that are going to address the access conditions around stations. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that in detail, so I'll leave it at that for now. The other key thing about the strategic plan is that at the time it got a lot of attention, both nationally and locally. One of our board members, when the plan was adopted, said this is the plan that everyone loves. And so it really sort of made the light bulb go on in terms of what we could do and really what we should be doing as a transit agency around this issue. The other sort of policy perspective that contributed to the development of a first last mile program has to do with co-benefits. The strategic plan itself was initiated by Metro and SCAG, our MPO, explicitly as one of the implementation actions around the region's sustainable community strategy and SB 375 for those of you who are involved in that policy realm. And so we were looking at a range of co-benefits around first last mile investment. The ones that you see on the slide have to do with safety, which I think is going to be familiar for all of you who are involved in active transportation planning and project implementation. And again, thinking about first last mile as a way to organize our activities around active transportation. And then we've gotten over the years a lot of mileage out of this next slide, which has to do with the sustainability benefits of investing in active transportation generally, but more specifically in first last mile. And I think the slide sort of speaks for itself, but the idea is you get some benefit out of eliminating part of an automobile trip, but you get huge benefits if you're allowing people to make all of their travel by transit or by transit and a combination with walking and biking trips. And then so we have the first last mile strategic plan in 2014. As I mentioned, it was getting a lot of attention and positive feedback from jurisdictions around the region, from members of our board of directors, nationally with an award from the American Planning Association. And then that all sort of culminates in 2016 when we got policy direction from the Metro Board that forms what is now our first last mile program. So motions 14.1 and 14.2 in May of June in 2016 essentially have these memorized. This is what I live and breathe every day. So there's a bunch of stuff going on in these motions, but the key pieces are what you see on the slide. The first has to do with integrating first last mile planning and delivery into new transit projects. And for those of you that aren't up to date on what's been going on in Los Angeles around transit, we are in a major expansion mode. We have 10 new rail projects or expansions of existing extensions of existing rail lines that are funded through a combination of sales tax measures, notably Measure M from 2016, that is investing billions of dollars in transit around LA County. So what the board is telling us is, as you build this expansion of the system, get those access and safety improvements around the stations integrated as part of that project delivery process. They're also directing us to provide attention to the existing transit system and directed that we prepare plans following that first last mile strategic plan methodology around 269 station and stop locations around LA County. So what that is the entirety of the existing rail network, the commuter rail stations, and then the top 100 ridership bus stop locations around the county. The balance of the policy direction that we got in 2016 has to do with a number of funding, technical assistance, and implementation incentives, which may be a little bit too inside baseball for LA County stuff for this audience, but if there are questions around that, I'm happy to address those in the Q&A period. So let me then transition to what the planning techniques consist of. Again, this is sort of a guided tour of the first last mile strategic plan. That strategic plan is available to you on the Metro website and is intended to be a resource for anyone doing this type of work and provide this sort of very structured stepwise approach to developing a plan for any transit station. These are the steps. They have to do with defining the site area, analyzing existing conditions at really two levels, and I'll talk about that in more detail in a second. Then laying out the pathway network. Pathway network is really the key concept in our first last mile planning methodology. It has to do with identifying the key streets or other access routes that transit riders are going to use, either because they're connecting the transit station to a key destination, or they're just the nodes that provide direct connections to the station itself. We also talk about the pathway network as being important in establishing that we're not really interested or able to adopt every street or take an interest in every street around transit stations. We're trying to prioritize where we plan and invest based on those places that are most important for transit riders. And then community engagement is really what sort of ties it all together and allows us to move forward with a program of improvements that is viable, has support, and is reflecting what transit riders and future transit riders are telling us they need and will use. So this is a snapshot of the first part of the existing conditions analysis. This is the GIS or data piece. So we're looking at a number of data layers that are starting to tell us a story about what's going on around a transit station. Collision data is one of the more important ones that we look at. The roadway volumes and speeds, the land uses and destinations, and this will all sort of give us a beginning indication of what that pathway network should look like. The second piece, and this has really become a critical part of our planning process, is the walk audit. So anytime we do a plan, we send teams out into the field to do a primarily subjective assessment of the existing conditions. This is done according to a series of set checklists that you see displayed on the slide. There's a link to where you can access those, and you can use them in your own work. There's some variation in how we do walk audits from place to place, from project to project. Sometimes we do this as a technical exercise with our consultants and staff, local agency partners. Sometimes we do it as a combination of a technical exercise and then involve the community as part of our outreach and engagement activities as well. So we send our teams out in the field with maps as well as with the checklists. And then we're able to gather a number of observations as part of the walk audit, both in terms of the obstacles and barriers that exist, the strengths and opportunities, ideas for improvements, And then sometimes we're capturing some notes around observed behaviors as well. And we always find it really instructive, like when we see somebody biking against traffic or biking on the sidewalk. Those are the types of things that are helpful for us to note in the walk audit. So one of the things that we learned after having done walk audits in a number of places was that in our first couple of projects, we were using paper checklists and maps. And the issue there was sort of the data that we were getting was only as good as the person's handwriting that was out in the field or their ability to accurately place a dot on a paper map. We were also looking ahead to like the number of places that we were going to be doing this around the county and thinking that there's an opportunity for us to build a really great data set around existing conditions around transit stations in LA County. So we took the additional step of developing a mobile app for our walk audits going forward, and we now had the opportunity to use this a couple of times. So what happens now is we send our teams out in the field with tablets or with smartphones. They're making their walk audit observations directly on the device. It's feeding a database in real time. It's geocoded, so the data that we record is really accurate, and we're able to also attach and associate photos with the observations that get recorded. We have a test site. There's a link for that on the slide, so you're welcome to take a look at it and play around with it. And we are interested in making this available to other agencies that are doing this type of work. So we're happy to follow up with that on that if anyone has that interest. When we use the walk audit app, this is what the observations look like on the back end. So the red dots that you see are barriers that were observed on this walk audit. The green are strengths, and the purple were ideas. And again, this is feeding a database in real time, and what we end up with is a pretty rich set of information every time we send a team out in the field. So this is the pathway network that I talked about a minute ago. So this is an example from the Blue Line First Last Mile planning activity that we did through 2017 and into 2018. This is San Pedro Street Station on the Blue Line. And so what you see are the darker blue lines are what we call pathway, either primaries or arterials. These are the direct connections to the stations, and we think the most important access route. And then the lighter blue are feeders or secondary access routes. All of the improvements that we contemplate as part of a First Last Mile plan, and you see them all reflected there as the little blue icons, are located on the pathway network. And so what we're envisioning going forward is these pathway networks get a range of treatments around sidewalk improvements, crosswalk improvements, lighting, landscaping, and among many other things. So let me then transition to talk about community engagement. This is, again, the fourth step in the planning methodology. And as we have prepared now a number of First Last Mile plans around the region, we have both sort of grown our understanding of the importance of community engagement and how to do it in a way that really supports the objectives and larger vision of the program. So we're doing community engagement in order to get real on-the-ground input from transit riders and potential transit riders that informs the plans. We are also after building a constituency or support so that the improvements that the plans contemplate have a good chance of getting implemented. In some communities around LA County, there are issues around either public agency credibility. Sometimes we've heard about phenomena called planning fatigue, where communities can be a little bit talked out. And so a lot of our approach and techniques around community engagement are trying to be mindful of those types of issues. Our real big learning experience for community engagement was on that Blue Line project. That was the first time we did a comprehensive First Last Mile plan. On that one, we engaged community-based organizations. There were 7 of them as a team, ranging from a fairly large and established LA County Bike Coalition as a countywide CBO, but most of the team was very localized, very grassroots organizations that came together to work with us on this plan. And as I mentioned, we learned a lot from it. Working with this team, some of the things that came through that were to expect a broad range of issues, not necessarily limited to safety and access issues for public transit. As part of an engagement process, people wanted to talk to us about equity, displacement, policing and security issues, affordable housing, so on and so forth. It was an effort not only to sort of get on the same page and have the same level of expectations with community-based organizations, but even just to sort of develop trust and rapport among our team, and then be able to have a larger, open, trusting conversation with the broader community. At the end of the day, though, we think what emerged from that was a new and better set of relationships, but also a better set and a more sort of usable set of input to inform what went into the plan. It became this experience that we went through on the Blue Line ended up in a good place, and both became an expectation for all of our first last mile planning work going forward. So we're now using community-based organizations wherever we can in our efforts, but then became a model for sort of new engagement opportunities and approaches for the entire agency. So the Metro is currently working on an agency-wide program to engage and involve community-based organizations on a range of projects, not just limited to first last mile. For the Blue Line project, this is some examples of what that looked like. So again, with a number of the organizations that we work with, what they were primarily focused on was both developing and staffing our events where we were asking for feedback from the community. So that often took the form of bike rides or community parties or pop-up events at stations. And so we're able to actually get real feedback from people who are out and about experiencing their day, and often people who are riding transit, so really the core constituency that we're trying to serve through these efforts. Sometimes on other projects that took the form of these sort of fun exercises where people are mapping out their intended travel routes with yarn. And then just transitioning a little bit here, the other thing that we worked with community-based organizations on the Blue Line and some of our other projects is the walk audits. I just wanted to show you a series of images from that walk audit experience with the community-based organization. This is from the Blue Line project. So you see some of the issues there around grade crossings, some of the adjacent streets, and see our team out there making observations. So on one of our other projects, the Foothill Gold Line extension, the CBO that we were working with brought a wheelchair to all of the walk audits, and often had a member of the community participant in the walk audit use the wheelchair for the walk audit, even if they're not somebody that uses a wheelchair every day. And so this is like pretty ubiquitous circumstance for people traveling around LA County, where you see these cracked sidewalks that might not be a big deal for somebody that's walking, but can be a major obstruction for people in a wheelchair. And it's always important for us to be able to capture multiple perspectives as part of our walk audits. This is Blue Line again. So what you see going on here are some improvements to the crossing infrastructure and gates at the Blue Line tracks, which is the set of tracks that you see in the foreground. But then in the background, you see freight rail tracks that run parallel to the Blue Line and have a different set of treatments and protection for people who obviously need to make that entire crossing, both across the light rail tracks, the freight tracks, and then the street beyond it. This is Slauson Station on the blue line. There's a lot going on here. So our walk audit for that project happened to be in January of 2017, which was the first rainy month that we had in Los Angeles in about 5 years. So one of the things we were able to capture is where stormwater gathers and what impact that has on travel. But you also just see like a really complicated and not terribly hospitable environment for people who are making connections to this station. And so to tie this all together, we have this process, we make observations, we involve the community in that process, and then it results in a plan. And we want that plan to be presented or reflected as a vision for how the rights-of-way can function in order to better support this multimodal trip making. So this is what a lot of streets look like around LA County. This is a good representation of what we want how we want the first last mile vision to be portrayed. Here are some other sort of before and after renderings. This is from our Foothill Gold Line Extension project. This is downtown Glendora, so more of a suburban environment. Another example from the Foothill project, I think this is Glendora again, where you just see like there's in the existing image that's in the background just a lot of right-of-way and a not very clear environment for walking and biking. You see some of the types of improvements that are contemplated in the lower image that has the buffered bike lane and the travel lanes as well. And then another one from the Foothill project, I believe this is now Laverne, where you see just some more creative thinking around how that excess right-of-way with the landscaping can support bicyclists, pedestrians, and just create a better feel for people who are navigating around this neighborhood. And then this is an image of some actual on-the-ground improvements. This is Santa Monica, which is the end of the line, 4th Street station for the Expo line that opened back in 2016. So what you see here is a lot of the different types of first last mile toolkit improvements that our plans contemplate. You have a two-way cycle track. You have a wider sidewalk than what was there previously, and then all of these visual cues about placemaking and travel. What you see in the couple blocks down in the back of the image is the archway entrance to the Santa Monica Pier. So obviously that's going to be a big attractor for a lot of people that are getting off of the rail station at that location. And then this is what the same set of improvements looks like closer to the station. So there's the wayfinding elements, the placemaking elements, and then those actual infrastructure transportation improvements that you saw in the other image. Then just turning the tables quickly to sort of the role of the State After Transportation Program and what we're up to at Metro. So I mentioned or described this very broad set of directives and policies that we respond to from the Metro Board to implement first last mile with all of our new transit projects, to plan and then enable implementation for the existing system. So if we take a step back and look at that, what that amounts to at the system-wide level, we're looking at trying to fund improvements for close to 400 stations. We, of course, are a funder as well as a planner and implementer. Our recent sales tax measure, Measure M, included $2.4 billion set aside for active transportation. That's the first time we've had dedicated funding for active transportation investment in any of our sales tax measures. But we have tremendous needs, and we view each of these stations that we plan as part of the first last mile portfolio as being on average a $10 million proposition. So if we're just looking at the just looking at the new transit portfolio, which is approximately 100 stations, that alone is $1 billion proposition. So we intend to be aggressively directing our resources to implement this overall vision, but we have a need for the state to be a funding partner as well. So as we develop plans, part of what we have in mind is, looking at those locations around the county that are well positioned to compete for ATP resources. In a lot of cases, we provide grant writing assistance in order to be able to access state funding. Our story in terms of ATP funding to date largely has to do with the Blue Line plan that I talked about. That was an ATP planning grant from Cycle 1, and we were thrilled to have that, and it was an important part of being able to kickstart the program. We have to date assisted a number of jurisdictions in seeking funding associated with implementation of that Blue Line plan. We haven't had success on that to date, and we're looking forward to getting a few more projects in the mix for Cycle 5. So that brings my presentation to a close, and remind me, I think we were supposed to take a couple of questions now before we have a broader Q&A session at the end. But in any event, thank you all for your time and for joining the webinar today, and it's great to have the chance to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Jacob. That was absolutely wonderful. I'm looking to the chat function right now in our WebEx system and not seeing any questions. Yeah, at this point in time, I think we're going to switch over to Shannon Simons, and I apologize earlier for the mispronunciation. So we'll resume with question and answers after Shannon's presentation. So Shannon's in the room with us. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Good morning.
All right.
Thanks, Victoria. So and thanks, Jacob. I will admit that a lot of the great ideas that we're trying to incorporate up at the state level do originate in LA Metro, and so I think that it's a great partnership in having us both here today as well. And so I'm going to talk a bit about connecting transit and from the state's perspective. So the main things that I'm going to talk about today are the state's first and last mile framework, the priorities for the division that I'm in, which is the Division of Rail and Mass Transportation at Caltrans. Then I'm going to move on to talk a bit about state resources, and then what we're doing in terms of high-speed rail coordination at the state level, and then some next steps. So state first and last mile framework. What is Caltrans' role? I think one of the main things that I want to highlight off the top is that I think one of the exciting reasons we're here at the Active Transportation Resource Center webinar as a transit professional is that all of this is getting us towards our overarching principle of reducing vehicle miles traveled in a way that supports the state's mobility, climate, as well as our equity goals. And specifically, I think it's exciting to talk about active transportation because I think we forget that all transit riders at some point of their journey are pedestrians. No one just kind of materializes at a bus stop. And so whether you're walking from your parking spot, from your house, from a different bus or rail connection, there is an element of being a pedestrian as well in being a transit user. So from there, I kind of want to talk about some of the Caltrans strategic goals that get us towards the integration of biking and walking with transit. So first is our Smart Mobility Framework, which was first established back in 2010. And you can see here the guiding principles of this, which are location efficiency, reliable mobility, health and safety, environmental stewardship, social equity, and a robust economy. And all of this really sets the stage for why we're creating other strategic documents and specific modal documents to highlight the connectedness between biking, walking, and transit. So then we also have the Caltrans Strategic Management Plan, and a highlight from this is that we have a goal of tripling bicycling, doubling walking, and doubling transit by 2020, which is now. And so, we have to acknowledge that we are still falling short on this due to some other factors. And so I think it's really important and timely to have this conversation about how do we continue to strive for these goals. And then we have our California Transportation Plan. One of the main goals relating to first and last mile is to improve multimodal mobility and accessibility for all people. Towards an Active California was the state's first ever statewide bicycle and pedestrian plan, and they have principles specifically talking about incorporating first and last mile planning for pedestrian access needs. And then last, I want to talk about the Caltrans Active Transportation Plans. So this is an implementation of the Towards an Active California plan that I was just mentioning. These active transportation plans are to establish a method for bicycle and pedestrian location-based needs to be identified and evaluated on or near the state highway system. So this is really exciting because there are different statewide and then Caltrans district goals that are going to be really focused on social equity throughout the process, strengthening the partnerships between Caltrans and our local partners, as well as connecting to local networks, which I think is where we really get into the first and last mile piece. And then from this, there will be products including final plans, GIS shapefiles, interactive web-based, location-based needs map, and a statewide data framework and methodology memo. And so all of this, again, like Jacob's tools, are going to be able to be extrapolated out and useful for our partners as we work towards off-highway system, location-based needs, as well as really identifying gaps in access to the transit network. So the next part I want to move into is the priorities for the Division of Rail and Mass Transportation. So again, as you may have heard in Victoria's introduction, that is where I work, and so that is really how I'm going to focus a lot of the discussion for the remaining portion of my presentation and kind of explain why our division is interested in partnering with our other Caltrans folks as well as everyone on this call. So I'm going to talk about three main portions. So again, our division is focused on rail and transit, and one of our main charges is to write and update the state and federally mandated California State Rail Plan. So in 2018, we took a new approach to this planning process, and rather than delivering an inventory of existing services as we had done in the past, we really undertook a complex service planning exercise to look at how to truly integrate a statewide network of rail and transit. But if we only consider those modes in a vacuum, we miss the opportunities to really combine the strengths of what we call the kind of, quote, allied modes, which we think of as biking, walking, transit, and rail. And there's really an opportunity here then to lift all boats by integrating and investing in these modes together. So understanding how various modes relate to each other is a critical part of transforming the non-auto modes into a resilient transportation system that can be time and cost competitive in a way that is also enjoyable to the traveler. So today I want to focus on the three following priorities for our division, which are network connectivity, station access, and then trip planning and payments. And so we're going to start with network connectivity. So this image may be a little abstract for those of you not steeped in the rail ridership context, so let me explain it. So what this is showing is a statewide integrated network of services. So on the left, you have on the left of the left image, you have the 2010 base year showing trips made between county pairs. So you can see all of the lines, those are aggregated data lines, and the width indicates the number of trips. So you can see, trips between Yolo County and Sacramento County. And then on the right of that image is the 2040 ridership between those same county pairs if we build out only business as usual. So growing largely just based on population growth and planned services that are in our transit and rail partners, their own planning documents. However, on the right side, that second map is showing the potential ridership gains when we integrate services. So again, on the left, we have kind of your base year 2010, and then on the right, we have all of the potential you can unlock when you integrate services, and that means physical integration, schedule integration, ticketing integration, as well as trip planning integration. And not only are more trips being made to the same places, but new trips are being made between counties that were previously off limits and unreachable by rail and by transit. And so then by integrating the first and last mile connections with either feeder transit or bike and pedestrian infrastructure and education improvements really only enhances this to fully realize the benefits of an integrated system across California. So with that, I want to talk about our next priority, which is station access. So all of that is kind of underlying. We know what the potential is if we can integrate the kind of the big trunk line systems of the intercity rail and bus services. But then we have to get people to and from the station. So as Jacob articulated really clearly, there are many reasons why there can be challenges getting to and from a station. And so we are at our division are big fans of best practices. So whether it's looking to our partners at LA Metro or looking at so many of the great examples that already exist throughout the world, we don't really want to reinvent the wheel, but we want to strive to make what's already out there possible in California to hit that triple double goal. So that we can just adapt these best practices to our specific needs, but not necessarily needing to fully come up with new practices. And so bike and pedestrian connections to transit and rail are often an overlooked piece of this multimodal puzzle. But inviting cyclists and pedestrians to the station is one of the easiest and most affordable things that we can do to really extend the rail system and include that first last mile as a piece of the trip. And so much of the work to integrate bikes and trains, especially here in California, has focused on getting more bikes on trains. This is, a really great opportunity for people to bring their first and last mile mode with them, and great strides have been made in this arena, but there are certainly trade-offs in this approach. So entire train cars then become dedicated to moving bikes around when we could instead be moving people around and not only earning revenue, but incentivizing more mode shift. Safe, secure, and sheltered bike parking needs to be a part of this solution. That is one way that we can really accommodate having people bring their own bike to either their first mile or their last mile. But we also then, to account for all of that, need to look at opportunities to partner with bike share systems and scooter share systems and all sorts of new technologies that are bringing microtransit and other forms of kind of on-demand transit options and biking and walking options to the station. And so in 2016, there were 28 million trips taken on bike share systems in the U.S., which is a 25% increase over the previous year. And that's about equal to all of the passengers carried by Amtrak nationwide. So there's huge potential to really make strategic partnerships at our stations and our bus stops across the state to incentivize shared bike modes. And so we want to ensure that we're drawing bike sharing into this world of allied modes, and continuing to work to coordinate access to the stations, fares, ticketing, parking, and all of the infrastructure that is needed for people to feel safe in choosing that option to access trains and transit. So the next couple slides, I just want to show some great examples from our Dutch and Swiss partners. So that last one, actually, we can go back one. This slide really just shows how many people are activated in the center. There's clear wayfinding to show where you're allowed to bike. You can see the bike parking close to the station, and it's just a really activated pedestrian and bike space. So this next one is a great example of bike parking. So there's tons of access, and it's right close to the train station, so there's no issues in having to walk a long way after you park your bike. This next station is a transfer station, and this is another great example of bike parking. So it's all in the station platform, and all you have to do is walk up a flight of stairs or hop in the elevator to get up to the train platform. So that is about the station access piece. And so another thing that I want to talk about that I've alluded to is the trip planning and payments, which can offer another hurdle in getting people to that first and last mile to and from transit. So our division has been working on a California integrated mobility and specifically on an integrated travel program. So what does that mean? So that it means improving the transit experience in California. It means promoting equity, increasing public agencies' buying power for technologies and services across the state. It means we're able to realize benefits for transit services and then, importantly, be able to meet our climate change laws. And so there's a lot going on in the integrated travel program, and it's physical infrastructure that we've talked about, but it's also really looking to the open payments, data standards, and inclusivity. So if we go to the next slide, this is an image you're all probably very familiar with. So this is just a screenshot from trying to plan a trip down in downtown Sacramento where I live and work. And so you can see that it shows a bunch of different options when you toggle to the transit function. So pretty, time competitive with both walking and driving, which is great. But if you click on any of those things, whether it's the bus or the light rail or the also consider scooter or a TNC, you can't actually purchase that in this app. So you can plan it, but then you have to go to another app that you have to have already linked up on your phone and able to buy that. So already that's a disconnect. If you want to just be able to take this trip, you can't right away. And at least on the transit options, you don't even know necessarily how to pay for that. Is it a physical ticket? Is it cash? Is it on my phone? Is it none of that? And so that's a problem on the payment side. On the trip planning side, another problem here is that we're only seeing the data that the public agencies using the General Transit Feed Specification are using, or GTFS. So if you're a transit agency who operates in this screenshot, but you don't have your GTFS loaded and accurate, you're not even showing up on this map, which means you're effectively eliminated from how people are experiencing trying to get around Sacramento. Similarly, on the public side, if you're not sharing access to this specific platform for the map, then you're not going to show up. And so then there creates, a competitive advantage for how you partner and who pays for access, which gets into a lot of the equity issues. And so one of the really exciting things that Caltrans and the Division of Rail and Mass Transit is looking at is how do we make all of this easier for the customer to eliminate a, kind of a technological first and last mile barrier to getting to transit. And so one of the things we're looking at is open payments to make it just convenient so that there's a back-end payment system where anyone with a tapped to pay credit card or watch or anything can use that without being connected to any sort of specific payment system, so that nothing is proprietary. It's just kind of everyone has access to it. Similarly, open data standards. This is really important to have reliable information. If you have bad information, especially on transit, that is often worse than having no information. And if you miss one connection, you can miss a doctor's appointment or a job interview or a connection to another bus or train, and then, that can have pretty dire ramifications, especially if you're someone who works in a service job and you can't be late to that and you can't miss certain appointments. So we're working to make sure that there's reliable information. And then finally, inclusivity. Equity underlines all of this. We want to make this fair and accessible to everyone, not just people who are savvy with technology or can afford to pay for boutique services, but really looking for central eligibility for discounts and access and how to get people into the system who may be unbanked, and actually using this as an opportunity to generate wealth and other kind of social and economic mobility on top of your physical mobility. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears. So that's kind of the priorities that we're working on, and I think a lot of the exciting opportunities to partner to solve some of the first and last mile challenges. But how do we pay for it? That's what everyone wants to know. That's really why I got invited. So what additional funding sources and just resources are available for first and last mile planning and project delivery? So I'm going to talk about a few of them, and all of these are not applicable broadly necessarily, and it really, for those of you on the call, coming from different agencies, this will apply to you in a myriad of ways. But the first two I want to talk about are both California Climate Investment Program. So the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program is to provide grants, again, from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to fund transformative capital improvements that will modernize California's intercity, commuter, and urban rail systems, as well as bus and ferry transit systems to significantly reduce emissions of greenhouse gas, vehicle miles traveled, and congestion. So while none of that has anything to do with walking and biking, one of the main co-benefits and secondary criteria that are a part of the guidelines this cycle are first and last mile access projects, as well as land use and housing connection. So this program is really evolving to try and meet the needs of Californians and California travelers, and so there is an opportunity. Again, you do need to have your primary focus be a transit construction project, but if there are opportunities to add bike and pedestrian first and last mile infrastructure to access that, there are opportunities to fund that through this program. And the second one is the Low Carbon Transit Operations Program, or LCTOP. This was created to provide operating and capital assistance for transit agencies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve mobility, with a priority on serving disadvantaged communities. So approved projects in this program support new or expanded bus or rail services, expanding intermodal transit facilities, and may include equipment acquisition, fueling, maintenance, and other costs. And so some of the opportunities for first and last mile here are more on the transit feeder side, but there's still opportunities to be able to pick people up in some of their their suburbs or communities that may be a little bit further from access and drop them at a transit hub to continue their journey. So the next 4 programs are funded largely or entirely through SB1, Rebuilding California. So the first one is the Solutions for Congested Corridors program, which is run through the California Transportation Commission. And some of the highlights from that program are, again, to reduce congestion and reduce vehicle miles traveled while promoting safety, accessibility, economic development, efficient land use, and then reducing air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. I think one of the key opportunities here is that this program requires applicants to have a comprehensive multimodal corridor plan and to have your projects in that plan. And so I think that biking and walking and transit plans together are excellent examples of multimodal corridors. And I think that this is a great opportunity for anyone on the phone who is thinking about this type of project to get in touch with their Caltrans district partners and really work to make sure that all of these great first and last mile projects are in these comprehensive multimodal corridor plans eligible for funding. So the next one is the Active Transportation Program, which I'm sure is the one many on this call are most familiar with. The large focus is to increase the portion of trips accomplished by biking and walking, as well as increasing safety and mobility for these non-motorized users, advance the active transportation efforts of regional agencies, enhance public health, and then ensure that disadvantaged communities fully share in the benefits of this program. And I think, again, the LA Metro example shows how they are really centering disadvantaged communities in their ATP award. So the next one is on the planning side. So we have the Sustainable Communities Planning Grants and the Strategic Partnership Planning Grants. So the first one is a $25 million program, which has half is competitive, and it's to encourage local and regional planning that furthers state goals, including practices tied to reducing GHG and sustainable community strategies. This is, I think, one of the best opportunities for those on the phone who are looking at just starting the first and last mile planning program or are even thinking about developing their own first and last mile strategic plan like LA Metro. We haven't seen any of those type of applications come through this program, but they're certainly eligible, and I think this is a really great opportunity to find some of those planning funds. The Strategic Partnerships Planning Grants are, there's a transit-specific portion, and so if you're a transit agency, definitely apply to this. I'm going to scream that again. Definitely apply to this if you're a transit agency. This tends to be a part of the planning program that is less advertised, but it's really looking to address a transit component to fund multimodal projects. And so huge opportunity to look at your first and last mile as part of either specific projects or as a program of projects for your entire agency. And so then the next slides have links to all of the funding programs as well as the lead person's contact information. On the LC top, you'll see that, again, because there's such a specific focus on disadvantaged communities, we do have a separate liaison if you have questions about the priority population, so feel free to reach out to any of these people. And then the next one, again, we just have more contact information for some of the other statewide plans that I discussed here today. So this will go out to everyone, so feel free to get in touch with anyone you see here and definitely check out the resources linked on these pages. And then quickly, I just want to touch on high-speed rail coordination. So, Caltrans is not the high-speed rail authority, but we do work closely with them. And so I pulled this next quote from the High-Speed Rail Authority on their Station Communities Plan. And so their vision is that a high-speed rail station will serve as more than just a train stop. They will transform cities, create community hubs, and be iconic of the state. And so I think this really sums up a lot of what we're trying to do, and not just creating better access in terms of bike and pedestrian infrastructure on our existing transit, but as we're developing these stations, to really eliminate the first and last mile barrier altogether. And so one way to do this is to effectively shrink your time-space continuum by changing your land use and your development choices. So, I think you can do this not just at high-speed rail stations, but anywhere where we're really looking at these more interconnected intermodal connectivity hubs to look to build housing and jobs and other mixes of uses at stations that create vibrant places that can spur local economy and eliminate the trip to the station altogether. These types of developments also lend themselves to the creation of pedestrian plazas, as well as the placemaking that make the stations themselves desirable and promote active modes like walking and biking. And so I think a good example, this is a rendering of a future high-speed rail station, but the San Jose Diridon station planning is now underway, a little more refined than this picture. And I think it's one of the great opportunities to create these multimodal connectivity hubs in a way that will create a pedestrian scale plaza and then actually help reknit the fabric of the urban core back together. So over time, based on, disinvestments and various development choices, and we've seen this in a lot of the urban centers across the state, we have real barriers that connect people from moving about and participating in the local economy. And good station design can reconnect neighborhoods and generate different scales of mobility that are oriented around walking and biking and then getting to your buses and trains easily to connect to those longer trips across the state or the region. And so to close up, I'm going to talk about next steps. So the first, again, as I mentioned, one of the main charges in our division is to write the state rail plan. So we are beginning that process for the next state rail plan. And one of the enhanced features we'll have this time is a station area and first and last mile inventory, as well as guiding policies. So we're really looking to do some of the heavy lifting like LA Metro has done around the major connectivity points in the system to identify gaps and then help put that into a strategic planning document so that the state can help our local partners to fill the gaps in the first and last mile network to get people safely to and from the rail and transit stations. The second thing is funding guidelines. So we are working with our partners in all of the programs that I mentioned, as well as other funding sources to include first and last mile language so that they are eligible projects, and then doing more webinars and outreach efforts like this so that people are aware of how to access those funding opportunities. And then lastly, implementation. So looking for different opportunities for quick wins as well as a longer programmatic strategy. And so I think one of the quick wins, although maybe the folks working on the district active transportation plans don't think they're too quick, but is a really great example of we're already implementing the state bike and ped plan and identifying a priority list of active transportation projects by Caltrans districts that can then go after funding to be implemented quickly. But then they also were setting up this longer programmatic strategy of how the state plans to invest. And so I think from our division's perspective, we're looking to expand that beyond the state highway system and really looking at how to have a programmatic first last mile strategy for getting to and from the core rail and transit network in the state. And so with that, I'll say thank you again for the time and looking forward to questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Shannon. That was fantastic. And as Shannon indicated, we're at the next portion of our webinar, which is the robust question and answer period. And we have a number of questions that have come in, so we're going to just work our way through the questions. And Jacob, I want to make sure that you're unmuted as well. Are you unmuted?
I should be.
Perfect. All right. Okay, the first question, I'm just going to kind of go through this list for now. So it's about electric charging it's about, this person has a personal question. I have an electric bike. Will electric charging ever be included as part of station enhancements?
Yeah, I mean, I think from our perspective, yes. That's, when I talk about safe, secure, sheltered bike parking, I think you're right. We need to add creative bike parking too, which includes electric bike sharing as well as parking for non-traditional bikes like cargo bikes and some other forms. So I think that's a great suggestion.
Okay. We have, Jacob, is there anything that you wanted to add to that? What's already happening?
Yeah, on one level, I think we're very responsive to what we hear as part of our community engagement process whenever we do a plan. So things like electric charging come up occasionally in our planning processes, and we will forward those as recommendations as part of plans, and then they can get in the mix for our implementation options. Also reminds me that we do operate at Metro a bike share program that is now introducing the electric assist bikes as part of the fleet for the bike share program. So that's just part of the larger toolkit of access solutions that get deployed whenever we're looking at first last mile for a station.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. All right. I know we had some outreach, we conducted some outreach earlier in the week, and we had a few questions that were sent to us previously that we'd like to have you, both of our speakers, answer. So the first one is about the ATP program. So the ATP guidelines are a little vague about whether improvements around transit stops, such as shelters, bike racks, lighting, et cetera, are eligible expenses for ATP. Will they be permitted for Cycle 5? And if so, will applicants need to prove these improvements, that these improvements will increase walking or biking to improve pedestrian and bicycle safety? If so, how?
Yeah, so this is Emily Abrahams, and I'll just jump in here to help answer this question. So yeah, I think in the ATP program, the guidelines state the primary purpose of the project has to be to increase the use of active transportation. So as long as that's the primary purpose, first and last mile projects are completely eligible. If you actually look in the guidelines in Appendix B, there are some example projects. So things like Safe Routes to Transit projects are eligible. It gives examples of things like encouraging transit by improving biking and walking routes to facilities and school bus stops. Secure bicycle parking is eligible at rail and transit stations, bicycle carrying facilities on public transit, and also the establishment or expansion of a bike share program, which was mentioned as kind of another strategy so you don't physically have to take your bike. Although the parking options at stations are another good alternative. So those things, are encouraged and eligible as part of ATP. Just keep in mind that the primary purpose has to be active transportation for that program. And another point to bring up is the CTC and Caltrans do like to see innovation. So, as long as you show that innovation, can justify it in your application, I think, those types of projects would be good projects.
Great.
I want to chime in there. And so one of the things that we observe through our planning processes, as well as have contributed to the discussion around the ATP program, is the importance of landscaping as part of a larger walkability strategy, and particularly tree planting. And it's actually, you see it in the slide that's currently being displayed. So we think trees are important for creating a pleasant walking environment and sense of place, but even more than that, for heat reduction. So here in Southern California, around a lot of places around LA County, lack of shade, exposure to heat, particularly when people are making transfers and having to wait for their transit ride, is a major issue in terms of people making transit trips and connections.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for both chiming in, Emily and Jacob. There was another question that came in prior to the webinar, and I'll read it now. There's no doubt that e-scooters play a significant role in achieving the goals of First Last Mile program. However, one can see the dangers that they pose to pedestrians when they share pedestrian walk paths. Are there any plans to develop separate infrastructure for them? I think, Jacob, you had mentioned that you might be.
Yes, so I'll jump in on that one. So e-scooters sort of dropped on us year and a half ago, and, it's sort of front and center in everyone's mind in terms of first last mile planning. As an agency, we have a lot of different levels of stake and perspectives on scooters, ranging from sort of where do they get parked at stations, how can they or can they be accommodated on the transit vehicles themselves. As far as our first last mile program, it sort of gets to the core of what the person is asking about, is what are the accommodations that need to be made in order for scooters to be operated safely on the streets. And so we have some work that's just getting underway that's looking at that question specifically, and it has to do with sort of opening up and re-examining the first last mile planning toolkit that I talked about in the presentation. So we're hoping to answer the question, like, should we just be building more protected bike lanes in order to accommodate scooters safely, in order to minimize the conflict with pedestrians. We had a concept that was raised in the strategic plan back in 2014 that suggested protected bike lanes that have a fast lane and a slow lane. So that's a concept that we want to give some more exploration and more airtime to in order to arrive at really what's the right design solution for scooters as a mode for making these multimodal connections.
Yeah, and I'll second that. And I think one thing at DRMT that we've been thinking a lot about is just redefining transit as bike share and scooter share, like you said, kind of landed on us very quickly. How, where do they fall? In some cases, they do act more like transit than they do like an active transportation mode. And so I think we're really looking to redefine how we think of it and how we could fund some of these things, and how then that means having dedicated spaces for all of these different modes to operate as safe as possible.
Excellent. Thank you so much. All right. So we're going to start going back to the Q&As, although I think what I'd like to do, just for the purposes of getting that poll question in, so we have that indication of who is actually joining us on the phone, I'd like to launch the poll that we wanted to do earlier. And we have 2 questions. And if you could respond right now, I don't believe we're going to pull up the slide with the poll questions, but I'll read them to you again. The first question is, how would you characterize your understanding of first last mile to transit projects? The responses are little or none, moderate or strong. And so we really hope that everyone can always give us this feedback about your level of understanding of first last mile. And I hope that I'm coming from that little or none shop, so I feel like hopefully this will be this webinar is also it's been positive for everyone of all different levels of experience. I really feel like there's been a wealth of information shared already. Okay, and then the second question is, how often do you address transit in your work? And we're asking this. We primarily reach out to the active transportation community, but we wanted to see, since this webinar was shared statewide with a number of different departments and entities, we wanted to see if we actually are hitting a different audience that we normally reach. Okay, so Emily, I think we're going to have maybe take another, I want to give another 10 seconds. So if you can just respond, we'd really appreciate it. And yeah, let's just close that poll right now, I think. All right. Okay, so we had, and the results, you can just pull those up. And thank you for everyone for being patient. We just get those responses recorded in our system as well. A little frozen. Okay. All right. Well,
while we're doing this, I noticed there was a question specifically about the ridership chart, so I'll just address that quickly, asking why there were still some counties that have no lines between them. I should have been clear. The modeling that was done for this is specifically on the core services of the kind of intercity and commuter rail lines and intercity bus services. So this is not to say that there won't be local services connecting into the state network, but those were not captured in the ridership.
Okay. All right. I'm going to shift us now. I think that for some reason, we're getting numbers, but I was hoping to report on a percentage. But we're seeing a range. So there's I think a lot of folks are in that moderate and strong, and so hopefully this has been helpful, and I do feel like we have been addressing this topic at a very high level, so I think that's helpful. Okay, so let's go back to the question and answer chat, and please keep on sending your questions. I have a question about supporting wheelchair access and navigation as part of First Last Mile. Shannon, do you want to start? And
Sure.
Then Jacob, you could chime in afterwards.
Yeah, and I will highlight Jacob's slide again with the correct sidewalks and the wheelchair user trying to navigate that this is obviously an important point. And I think one thing my boss likes to say is that if you solve for bikes, you solve for a lot of other users. And so I think if we keep thinking about that, like if you can bike there, if you can bike along the surface and navigate it and feel safely, obviously a little bit different because it's on road versus on sidewalk, but the same principles apply. We want to create places that are dedicated for walkers and wheelchair users and other mobility users of different mobility services, and then on-road protected spaces for scooters and bicyclists. But yeah, we definitely want to accommodate that. Our buses and trains accommodate that, and we need to make sure that that's part of the access conversation as well.
So yeah, for us, I think the first thing is to just remember that people using wheelchairs are often core transit riders, and it's certainly to our benefit as a transit agency to serve people in wheelchairs as best we can, and to give people the opportunity to ride the fixed route transit network, and in so doing try to avoid a much more expensive for us and a much less convenient trip for the user on access services. So as far as how that gets reflected in First Last Mile planning, you saw the slide earlier about sort of the observations that we make around in the walk audit process. We always tell our walk auditors whether they're the one person that gets to do the walk audit in a wheelchair or not. It's just imagine that you are in a wheelchair, imagine that you're pushing a stroller, and try to get at solutions that are going to work for everybody that's using the transit system. The other thing that we often think about, apart from the condition of the sidewalk, is the width and the presence or absence of obstructions. So oftentimes we have utility boxes or signs that are blocking part of the sidewalk. Not a big deal for anyone on foot. But if you're in a wheelchair, if there's two people in a wheelchair, or one person in a wheelchair and another person pushing a stroller, the ability to navigate that environment is quite a bit more complicated. So we have a great opportunity to capture information on all of those conditions whenever we're doing one of our planning exercises.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. We have a question from within the room here at CDPH, and it's actually for you, Jacob. So you mentioned that for the Balloon Line project that you Metro had engaged community-based organizations for helping to, as part of the team approach to help with the outreach. Our question was around training for the community-based organizations. Was that a part of the process, and if so, what did that entail, and how were you able to set that piece? As our understanding is that sometimes there's some training and knowledge building that might need to happen first, and then there's logistically that needs to be laid out as well.
That is a great question, and maybe unpacks a little bit more than the questioner might have had in mind. So we did have a training built into the process. That the formal training that we provided was largely around the walk audit, and for the CBOs, how to facilitate the walk audits, as well as sort of what types of conditions people should be looking for in recording as part of the walk audit experience. As it turned out, I would say as we went through the entirety of the planning process, the CBOs trained us as much as we trained them. And there was some intentionality on our parts in terms of the way that we structured the project, that we would get at different types of conversations and different types of issues with the community by virtue of working with community-based organizations, but that was sort of much more eye-opening and much more of a learning experience than we ever anticipated. And then I think there was, what was really most effective was on top of the formal training, just this ongoing and intensive dialogue between Metro staff, our planning consultant team, and our CBO partners. And I would really just encourage for anybody that's thinking about working with community-based organizations is to make sure that you have ongoing and open communication forums as part of that process.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much. That was really helpful. And we may actually tap you a little bit later, Jacob, for existing training materials or guidance documents that would help other jurisdictions implement that kind of training if they are able to work with community-based organizations on these kinds of planning projects.
Yeah, happy to do that.
Great. All right. We did have another question about ATP around non-infrastructure programming and non-infrastructure program elements of the ATP program often address public education and encouragement and enforcement. So this question was for Emily. Do you have any ideas about how a non-infrastructure component could be built into the delivery of a first last mile project?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously that would be an eligible type of project in the ATP. Not all projects are infrastructure, so there is the non-infrastructure component. And yeah, first last mile education could definitely be included in that. We did a quick scan of past projects, and there actually was only one project that was a combination project that maybe addressed some of transit first last mile within their non-infrastructure component, but there really hasn't been one or much. So it's definitely an area that's kind of untapped. And yeah, you could kind of use the same non-infrastructure strategies to really be able to connect transit to biking and walking and get that first last mile. Like I said before, the primary purpose does have to be for active transportation and increasing the use of it through education and encouragement. But connecting that to transit and providing that education of that linkage, I think, is very important, and again, could get that mode shift going. So I think that's kind of my perspective on that.
Perfect. Thank you. That's great. We have another question that came to us. Will there be efforts to consolidate and or integrate other programs into first last mile, including safety, transit, and other similar programs that can facilitate first last mile? I'm looking to Shannon.
Yeah. And so again, from my perspective, we're at least on the funding side trying to do this to work with some of our partners, whether it's Emily with the ATP program or some of the others, to explicitly include first and last mile language and first and last mile projects as eligible projects, both on planning, infrastructure, non-infrastructure, construction, whatever it is. And I think this definitely includes safety. I think safety is one of the key reasons to do this. In terms of some of the safety-specific programs, I can't speak to that, but we're certainly interested in partnering with our Caltrans programs to make sure first last mile is in everything. That's my ultimate goal, first last mile takeover.
So what I would add there is, and it's really actually a critical point about our program, is that as the transit agency, we don't control any of the public right-of-way. So we do our best to plan and provide some resources and guidance toward implementation, but we always need to partner with a local jurisdiction in order to get projects implemented. And so often what that entails is sort of meeting them where they are. So increasingly we have jurisdictions around LA County that have like a Vision Zero program, or it may be a complete streets plan or policy or a safe routes to school policy. And so that integration of different policy programs or objectives is sort of how we form the partnership in order to get these types of improvements moving forward.
Great. Thank you both so much for those answers. I'm looking to the chat box, and at this point in time, looks like we have one more question. About, is this applicable on tribal lands? If so, have any tribal governments, reservations, rancherias have been involved to date with first last mile planning or delivery? I don't believe, based on the scan that we did of the ATP grants, that tribes have been involved to date. But of course, they are eligible. They're eligible for the ATP program and for all the other programs that I believe that Shannon covered.
Yeah, not in my experiences. For state rail plan development, we do outreach to the tribal communities, but those tend to be a lot more about potential right-of-way encroachment on tribal lands and other things like that. It hasn't really got down to the scale of first and last mile, so not in my work, at least.
Okay. Yeah, and I just wanted to echo what Victoria said. Tribal governments are eligible for any of these programs. So it's just there hasn't been a first last mile project per se that a tribe has done, but they've done other projects.
Right. And Jacob, in your region, has that come up for you?
Has not come up.
All right. All right. And are any other questions coming through? All right. Well, we appreciate all of the questions and all of the responses from our panelists. So thank you. I'm actually going to move us. We're almost near the end of our hour and a half, so I just have a few closing announcements. First off, your feedback is important. Upon the conclusion of this webinar, we will be sending out a survey gizmo so that we can get your feedback on today's webinar. You also will have the opportunity to express any interest you might have in receiving technical assistance from the Active Transportation Resource Center. So please do the survey. Next slide. As many of you are aware, the guidance planning for ATP Cycle 5 is in process. There are a number of public workshops that are being hosted by the California Transportation Commission, so you want to make sure that if you're interested in weighing in on the guidance, that you're attending, listening in on to those workshops. There's a link there, which we'll also send out post-webinar. The call for projects is expected to be March 25th, 2020, with applications due around June 15th. There are multiple components to the Active Transportation Program, as well. You're aware. There's a statewide component, a small urban and rural component, as well as the MPO components for the 10 largest metropolitan planning organizations. The statewide and small urban rural recommendations from CT staff will come out in October. And then they'll go through another vetting process, and then in December, in early December, it's expected that CTC will adopt the ATP Cycle 5 statewide and small urban and rural program components. So just lastly, I want to highlight the ATP website on the Caltrans, the California Transportation Commission's website, which is there. Next slide. Also want to highlight the ATRC has another webinar coming up, and this one will be on the Healthy Places Index, which is a tool to help assess public health needs and health equity needs, as well as provide information that can help you qualify your jurisdictions as disadvantaged communities. So please stay tuned for registration details. And then again, just highlighting that the Active Transportation Resource has a very robust website with many resources already available, so please check it out. It's been recently updated. And that's what we have. I want to thank our presenters, Jacob and Shannon, really wonderful information. We appreciate it. Thank you, Emily Abrahams, for being in the room. This is our contact information, and please be sure to join us for our upcoming webinars and teleconferences. Thank you so much.